Most people visit Michigan for the lakes, but I went there to find the truth behind the places everyone warns you to avoid. These 7 towns aren't just names on a map, they are living nightmares where the air feels heavy with regret. Forget what you've read online, I've seen the shadows moving in these streets myself. If you think you know Michigan, wait until you see the side they tried to bury. Stick around, because once you enter these 7 gates, there's no turning back. If you're not afraid of the truth hiding in the shadows, subscribe and join the hunt. 1. Flint, water crisis and crime. This is the story of Flint, the first location on our locked list. This isn't just news, it's a nightmare I witnessed through the eyes of the people living there. I've written this as a raw, first-hand account to capture that eerie, grounded reality you need for the channel. I remember driving into Flint on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was a bruised shade of gray. At first glance, it looks like any other fading industrial town, but as you go deeper, the air starts to feel heavy, almost metallic. I pulled up to a small, weathered house on the east side to meet a family who had lived there for generations. The silence in the neighborhood was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't a peaceful silence, it was the kind of quiet you find in a graveyard before a storm. When I stepped inside, the mother, Sarah, didn't offer me a glass of water. She didn't even use the tap to wash the grime off her hands. Instead, she pointed to a mountain of plastic bottles stacked in the corner of her kitchen. That was my first real spike of realization. In this part of America, the very thing that gives life had turned into a silent killer. She took me to the bathroom and turned the faucet just a tiny bit. The liquid that sputtered out wasn't clear. It was a sickly, pale yellow, smelling like a mixture of old pennies and bleach. It felt like watching a wound bleed. Sarah told me that the haunting started long before the news trucks arrived. It started with her children losing clumps of hair in the shower. It started with mysterious rashes that looked like burns, creeping up their legs. She described the feeling of realizing that for 2 years, she had been cooking pasta and making baby formula with water laced with lead and bacteria. The guilt in her voice was haunting, more terrifying than any ghost story I've ever heard. She felt like she had been poisoning her own bloodline while the people in power watched from their clean offices. As night fell, the vibe of the town shifted from depressing to truly eerie. I walked down a street where every third house was boarded up, the plywood rotting away. You could see the shadows of what used to be a thriving community, a child's tricycle left in a yard, now rusted orange, a porch swing moving slightly in the wind with no one on it. People here don't just hate the town because of the economy, they hate it because they feel trapped in a crime scene that never gets cleaned up. The real horror of Flint isn't just the water, it's the abandonment. I spoke to an old man sitting on a plastic crate near an empty gas station. He told me that at night, you can almost hear the pipes under the ground screaming. He wasn't joking. He believed the city itself was angry. He described seeing shadow people near the old Buick City factory site, ghosts of the workers who gave their lives to a company that eventually left them in the dirt. Whether those are real spirits or just the hallucinations of a broken population, the fear is 100% real. The spike in tension comes when you realize the crime isn't just the lead, it's the violence that grew out of the desperation. While I was there, the sound of a distant siren felt constant, like a heartbeat for a dying patient. You see it in the eyes of the teenagers on the corners, there is a coldness there, a lack of hope that makes the atmosphere feel dangerous. They aren't just hated towns on a list, they are places where the American dream went to die and forgot to bury itself. Walking back to my car, I felt a sharp itch on my own skin, probably psychological, but it made me realize why locals can't stand it. It's the feeling of being invisible. To the world, Flint is a headline, but to the person scrubbing their skin with bottled water in a cold kitchen, it's a living hell. As I drove past the city limits and saw the "Welcome to Flint" sign, I looked in my rearview mirror and felt a genuine chill. It felt like leaving a haunted house, except the ghosts are still inside, and they're still thirsty. This town doesn't just have a history, it has a grudge, and that grudge is what makes it one of the most hated places I have ever stepped foot in. 2. Detroit, abandoned buildings and danger. Driving into Detroit feels like entering a different dimension where time just stopped. On the locked list, this is point number 2, but in reality, it feels like the epicenter of everything that can go wrong with a city. I didn't want to just look at the skyline from a distance, I wanted to feel the pulse of the streets that people have abandoned. I remember parking my car near the old Michigan Central Station before they started renovating it. Back then, it was just a massive, hollow concrete skull staring at the city with empty eye sockets. The wind whistling through those broken windows sounded like a low, constant moan, and that was my first real spike of unease. It wasn't just a building, it felt like a monument to a collapsed civilization. I spent the evening walking through a neighborhood on the Lower East Side where the "hated" tag becomes painfully real. You see rows of houses where nature is literally eating the architecture. Trees are growing through living rooms, and vines are strangling porch pillars. I met a guy named Marcus who was sitting on his front steps, one of the only houses on the block that didn't have "Do Not Enter" spray painted on the door. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and told me that the real haunting isn't about ghosts, it's about the people who vanished. He described how, 10 years ago, he had neighbors on both sides, kids playing in the street, and the smell of backyard BBQs. Now, he's surrounded by ghost houses that attract things much scarier than spirits. As Marcus talked, the sun began to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. He pointed to the house directly across from him, a charred skeleton of a home. He told me that sometimes at night, he hears footsteps inside that house, even though the floorboards are gone. But the real spike in the story came when he said the police don't even come here anymore. If you call, you're on your own. That's the moment I felt a cold knot in my stomach. The horror of Detroit isn't a jump scare, it's the realization that you are standing in a place where the social contract has been torn up. You are in a dead zone where anything can happen, and no one is coming to save you. I decided to walk a bit further down the block, and the atmosphere shifted from lonely to predatory. Every rustle in the tall weeds felt like someone, or something, was watching. I stumbled upon an old playground where the swings were missing their seats, leaving just the rusted chains dangling. The wind caught them, and they clinked together with a metallic sound that felt like a warning. I started thinking about the thousands of families who just packed a bag and left their entire lives behind because the fear of staying became greater than the fear of the unknown. That's why locals can't stand it, they are living in a cemetery of memories, forced to watch their childhood homes rot into the ground. The most haunting part of the night was passing an old school. The doors were kicked in, and inside, I could see stacks of textbooks from the 1990s covered in thick dust. It felt like a crime scene where the victim was the future of the city. I realized then that Detroit is hated because it's a mirror. It shows what happens when a city is sucked dry and tossed aside. The locals who stay are survivors, but they are tired. They are tired of the sirens, tired of the ruin-porn tourists taking photos of their misery. And tired of the darkness that settles over the streets because the city can't afford to keep all the lights on. By the time I got back to my car, my heartbeat was thumping in my ears. I saw a group of stray dogs, massive, lean creatures, crossing the street a block away, and they moved with a coordination that felt almost supernatural. This isn't the Detroit from the travel brochures. This is the Detroit that keeps people awake at night, clutching a baseball bat or a prayer bead. As I drove away and saw the bright lights of the downtown stadiums in my mirror, I couldn't shake the image of Marcus sitting alone on his porch in the dark. The city is a beautiful disaster, a place where the line between the living and the dead is as thin as a sheet of rusted tin. It's a place that was loved to death and now haunts everyone who ever called it home. 3. Saginaw, economic decline and violence. Saginaw is a place that feels like it's being slowly erased from the map, and being there in person is an experience that stays under your skin long after you leave. On the locked list, it's point number 3, but for the people living there, it's a daily struggle against a shadow that never lifts. I remember pulling into the city limits just as a thick, low-hanging fog started rolling off the Saginaw River. The water looked oily and black, reflecting the skeletal remains of old warehouses that used to be the pride of the town. Now, they just look like hollow ribcages of a giant that died decades ago. The air didn't smell like a city, it smelled like damp concrete and old smoke, a heavy scent that makes you want to roll up your windows even if it's hot outside. I spent a few hours walking through the neighborhoods on the north side, and the first thing I noticed was the tension. It's a physical weight. Every person I passed gave me a look that wasn't exactly hostile, but it was incredibly guarded, like they were waiting for something bad to happen because, in Saginaw, it usually does. I sat down at a small, beat-up diner where the neon sign hummed so loudly it made my teeth ache. I met a woman there named Elena who had worked behind that counter for 30 years. She told me the real reason locals have such a love-hate relationship with this place isn't just the lack of jobs, it's the way the violence has become a part of the landscape, like the trees or the potholes. Elena leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper, and told me about a night she'll never forget. She was walking to her car after a late shift when she saw a group of kids, no older than 14, standing under a flickering street lamp. They weren't yelling or fighting, they were just standing there in total silence, staring at a boarded-up house across the street. She said the look on their faces wasn't one of mischief, but of pure, cold emptiness. That's a spike that hit me hard. The horror of Saginaw isn't just the crime statistics you read online, it's the way the city steals the childhood out of people's eyes before they even hit puberty. It's a place where hope feels like a luxury no one can afford. The atmosphere got even weirder when I decided to drive past some of the most notorious, hated, blocks. I saw houses that had been partially burned out, with charred curtains still fluttering in the broken windows like ghostly flags. I felt a sudden, sharp chill when I realized that in some of these homes, people were still living in the one room that wasn't touched by the fire. The desperation is so thick you can almost taste it. I stopped my car near an old park where the playground equipment was wrapped in yellow police tape that had faded to a sickly cream color. The swings were perfectly still, but the silence was interrupted by the distant, rhythmic, pop-pop of gunfire blocks away. It was so casual, so expected, that I didn't even jump, and that realization terrified me more than the sound itself. The haunted part of Saginaw isn't about lady-in-white ghosts or haunted hotels, it's the ghost of the industry that abandoned it. You can feel the resentment in the cracked sidewalks and the rusted-out Chevy trucks sitting in driveways. The locals can't stand it because they remember when this was a place of dignity, but now it feels like a dumping ground for problems the rest of the state wants to ignore. When I finally headed back toward the highway, I saw a billboard that was peeling so badly you could only make out the word, "Believe." Underneath it, someone had spray-painted, "In Nothing." That image stuck with me all the way home. Saginaw is a place where the darkness isn't just outside on the streets, it's moved inside the houses and into the hearts of the people who are too tired to leave. It's a town that feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for a final blow that never quite comes. As the city lights faded in my mirror, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief to be getting away, and a deep, aching guilt for the people who had to stay behind in the fog. That's the real story of Saginaw. It's a beautiful place that lost its soul somewhere in the factories, leaving behind a shell that's haunted by everything it used to be. 4. Muskegon Heights, Poverty and Poor Infrastructure. Muskegon Heights is a place that feels like it's being held together by nothing but grit and old prayers. On our locked list, this is point number 4, and honestly, it was the most unsettling place for me to walk through. It's not like the big, sprawling decay of Detroit, this is a small, concentrated pocket of struggle that feels like a pressure cooker. When I crossed the invisible line from Muskegon into Muskegon Heights, the transition was jarring. The smooth pavement suddenly turned into a maze of deep potholes and cracked asphalt, as if the ground itself was trying to swallow the street. The first thing I noticed was the lack of movement, hardly any cars, no kids playing. Just a heavy, humid stillness that made the back of my neck prickle. I remember standing in front of the old high school, a massive brick building that looked more like a fortress than a place of learning. I met a woman named Darlene who was waiting at a bus stop that looked like it hadn't seen a bus in years. She had lived in the Heights for 60 years, and her voice sounded like dry leaves scraping on a sidewalk. She told me the real reason locals can't stand it here isn't just the poverty, it's the feeling of being trapped in a sunken place. She pointed at the boarded-up windows of the school and told me that when the schools failed and the funding was pulled, the heart of the town was literally ripped out. Without the schools, there was no reason for the young families to stay, and the ones who couldn't afford to leave became the forgotten ones. The vibe shifted into something truly eerie as we talked. Darlene looked around to make sure no one was listening and whispered about the night walkers. She wasn't talking about ghosts in the traditional sense, but the people who roam the streets when the sun goes down because they have nowhere else to go. She described how the darkness here feels different, it's thicker because so many of the streetlights are broken or flickering. That's a major spike in the reality of this town. The darkness isn't just an absence of light, it's an invitation for the things people fear most. I felt a sudden jolt of adrenaline when a mangy dog barked from an alleyway, the sound echoing off the empty storefronts like a gunshot. I decided to drive deeper into the residential blocks, and that's where the real emotional weight hit me. I saw houses where the roofs had partially collapsed, yet there were still fresh curtains in the windows and a single light on inside. The resilience is haunting. I stopped near an overgrown lot where a house had clearly been demolished years ago, leaving only the front steps leading to nowhere. I sat there for a minute, and the silence was so loud it started to ring in my ears. I felt a weird sense of being watched from the surrounding houses, not with curiosity, but with a weary suspicion. In Muskegon Heights, a stranger isn't just a guest, a stranger is a potential threat or a sign of trouble. The most disturbing part of the trip was seeing how close the beauty of Michigan is to this hell. Just a few miles away are the stunning beaches of Lake Michigan, where tourists spend thousands of dollars, but in the Heights, people are struggling to buy basic groceries because the local stores have all shut down. This divide creates a resentment that you can feel in the air, it's a cold, sharp anger that makes the atmosphere feel electric and dangerous. Locals hate it because they are forced to watch the good life from across a border they can't cross. As I started my car to leave, I noticed a group of men standing under a lone, buzzing streetlight near a liquor store. They weren't doing anything, just standing in the shadows, their silhouettes long and distorted on the pavement. One of them caught my eye, and for a split second, I saw a reflection of pure, unfiltered hopelessness. It made me realize that the haunting of Muskegon Heights is the death of the American promise. It's a town that was built on industry and family, but now it's just a shell, haunted by the ghost of what it was supposed to be. Driving away, I felt a heavy knot of guilt in my chest, knowing I could leave while thousands were stuck in that cycle of decay. That's why it's one of the most hated towns, not because of the people, but because of the way the world turned its back on them and left them in the dark. 5. Benton Harbor, Economic Struggle and Neglect. Driving into Benton Harbor is one of the most jarring experiences you can have in Michigan. On the locked list, this is point number 5, and it's a place where the hate doesn't come from a deep, stinging sense of betrayal. I remember crossing the bridge from its sister city, St. Joseph. In St. Joseph, everything is perfect, boutiques, white sandy beaches, and tourists eating expensive ice cream. But the moment you cross that bridge into Benton Harbor, the color literally seems to drain out of the world. It's like stepping from a movie set into a war zone that everyone has agreed to stop talking about. I parked my car near an old, crumbling brick building that used to be a bustling factory. The air here felt different, salty from the lake, but mixed with the smell of rotting wood and wet earth. I met a man named Elias who was fishing in the murky waters of the canal. He didn't look at me at first, he just kept his eyes on the water. When I asked him why people around here felt so much resentment toward their own town, he pointed back toward the bridge I had just crossed. He told me the real horror isn't a ghost in an attic, it's the invisible wall that keeps his people in poverty while wealth sits just a few hundred yards away. That realization hit me like a physical punch. The spike in this story is the psychological torture of seeing the life you want every single day but knowing you can never touch it. As we talked, Elias told me about the voices of the town. He wasn't talking about spirits, but the echoes of the riots that tore this place apart years ago. He said when the wind blows through the empty windows of the abandoned Whirlpool buildings, it sounds like people screaming for justice. I walked further into the residential area, and the atmosphere became incredibly heavy. I saw beautiful old Victorian houses that should have been landmarks, but they were collapsing under the weight of neglect. Some were charred by fire, others were completely overtaken by weeds that looked like green claws pulling the structures into the dirt. It felt like the earth was trying to reclaim the city because humans had failed it so badly. The most eerie moment happened when I found myself near an old park at dusk. The shadows were stretching long across a rusted-out slide, and I saw a single pair of shoes hanging from a power line, swaying in the breeze. In many places, that's just a prank, but here, it felt like a marker for a life lost to the streets. I felt a sudden, cold shiver down my spine when I realized I was the only person on the street, yet I felt like 100 eyes were watching me from behind those cracked window panes. In Benton Harbor, you are never truly alone. You are surrounded by the weight of 1,000 broken dreams and a community that feels like it's been left to rot in the shadow of luxury. I started thinking about the water crisis here, similar to Flint but less talked about. People were told not to use their tap water for years because of lead. Elias had told me earlier that he felt like the government was waiting for them all to just fade away so they could take the land back. That's the real haunting of Benton Harbor, the feeling that you are a nuisance in your own home. The locals hate it because they love the land, but they feel like the world is trying to starve them out of it. By the time I headed back toward the bridge, the contrast felt sickening. I could see the bright, cheerful lights of the St. Joseph Carousel in the distance, while behind me, Benton Harbor sat in a thick, suffocating darkness. I felt a surge of genuine anger on behalf of the people I had seen. It's a place of incredible history and potential, but it's been turned into a ghost of itself. Driving away, I felt like I was escaping a sinking ship, and the guilt of leaving made my hands shake on the steering wheel. That is the true face of Benton Harbor, a town that is hated not because it's bad, but because it's been treated like it doesn't exist. It's a living wound on the coast of Lake Michigan that refuses to heal. 6. Pontiac, urban decay and job loss. Entering Pontiac feels like walking through a house where the owners left in a hurry and never came back. On our locked list, this is point number 6, and it's a place that genuinely unsettled me because of how quiet it is. Usually, cities have a hum, a sound of tires on pavement or distant voices, but Pontiac has this strange, hollowed-out silence that rings in your ears. I remember driving toward the site where the Silverdome used to stand, that massive stadium that once held the Super Bowl and thousands of screaming fans. Now, it's just a flat, paved scar on the earth. Standing there, I felt a physical sense of loss, as if the ground itself was mourning the ghost of its own importance. I decided to park near the old downtown area, where the buildings are tall and grand, built back when the car industry made everyone here feel untouchable. I met an older man named Arthur who was sitting on a bench outside a closed-up theater. His skin was like weathered leather, and he was staring at a row of empty storefronts with a look of pure exhaustion. He told me that the reason locals have grown to hate the town isn't just the job loss, it's the emptiness. He described how it feels to walk down a street that was designed for thousands of people, but you're the only soul in sight. He said, in Pontiac, the shadows are bigger than the people. That hit me like a spike of ice, the idea that the architecture of the past is literally overshadowing the living. As the afternoon sun started to fade, the vibe turned from lonely to something much more sinister. I started walking toward a residential pocket that had been hit hard by the economic crash. I saw houses that were architectural masterpieces, old stone work and stained glass, but they were crumbling, their porches sagging like broken jaws. One house had a "Beware of Dog" sign, but the fence was gone and the front door was hanging off a single hinge. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of fear when I heard a metallic clanging coming from inside one of those houses. It wasn't a ghost, it was likely someone stripping copper pipes, a common haunting in these parts where people destroy the bones of a house just to survive another day. I kept walking, and the atmosphere grew heavier with every step. I realized that the real horror of Pontiac is the betrayal of the company. Everyone here had a father or a grandfather who worked for GM, and when the factories tightened their belts and moved away, they didn't just take the money, they took the city's identity. Arthur had told me earlier that people here feel like they're living in a museum of a life they aren't allowed to have anymore. I looked at a group of young guys standing on a corner near a flickering street lamp. They weren't talking or looking at their phones, they were just staring into the distance with a cold, blank intensity. It made the hair on my arms stand up. In Pontiac, the anger isn't loud, it's a quiet, simmering resentment that feels like it could boil over at any second. The most haunting part of the night was finding an old park where the grass was knee-high. In the center was a bronze statue of a historical figure, but someone had spray-painted a thick red line across its eyes. It looked like the statue was bleeding. I stood there, and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of damp leaves and exhaust. I felt a weird sensation, like I was being watched by the city itself. Not by people, but by the buildings. They felt predatory, like they were waiting for me to trip or get lost so they could swallow me into their dark hallways. By the time I got back to my car, I was breathing fast. The silence of the city had become suffocating. I realized that people hate Pontiac because it's a constant reminder of how fast you can go from being the center of the world to being a forgotten footnote. It's a place where the haunted feeling comes from the contrast between the massive, beautiful structures and the desperate, struggling lives inside them. As I drove away, passing the empty lots and the "for sale" signs that looked like they had been there for a decade, I felt a deep sense of dread. It felt like the city was a black hole, pulling everything into its center, and if you stay too long, you might never find your way out. That's the real story of Pontiac. It's not a dead city, it's a city that's buried alive, and you can hear it scratching at the coffin from the inside. 7. Highland Park, Ghost Town Vibe and Financial Ruin. Highland Park is a place that shouldn't exist in a modern country, and standing in the middle of it at night is the most terrifying experience I've ever had in Michigan. On the locked list, this is point number 7, and it is the absolute definition of a ghost city. I remember crossing the city limits and the first thing I noticed wasn't what was there, but what was missing. The streetlights. Years ago, the city was so broke they couldn't pay the electricity bill, so the power company literally came and ripped the light poles out of the ground. Walking down a residential street in total, pitch-black darkness is a spike of fear that hits you right in the gut. You aren't just in a bad neighborhood, you are in a void where the basic rules of a city have vanished. I stood on a corner near the old Ford plant, the place where the assembly line was practically invented, and I felt a cold, heavy weight on my chest. This was once the city of trees, a wealthy enclave, but now it feels like a post-apocalyptic movie set. I met a man named Silas who was sitting on a plastic milk crate near a house that was leaning so far to one side I thought it would collapse if the wind blew. He didn't have a flashlight, he was just sitting there in the dark, his eyes adjusted to the gloom like a predator. He told me the real reason locals hate it here is the suffocation. He said when the lights went out, the soul of the city went out with them. He described how the crime moved in under the cover of that darkness, turning every shadows into a potential grave. The atmosphere became truly haunted when Silas told me about the disappearing houses. He pointed into the blackness where a row of homes used to be. Now, there was just tall, dry grass that hissed in the breeze. He said that in Highland Park, houses don't just get abandoned, they get stripped, burned, and then the earth just swallows them up. I felt a sharp jolt of adrenaline when I heard a floorboard snap inside the house behind him. There was no one supposed to be in there, but the sound was clear and heavy. Silas didn't even flinch. He told me that the ghosts of Highland Park are the people who have been pushed so far out of society that they've become invisible. That's a spike that makes your blood run cold, the realization that the shadows are inhabited by people with nothing left to lose. I decided to walk a block further, using only the light from my phone, and the sense of isolation was overwhelming. The sidewalks are so cracked that trees are growing through the concrete, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers in the dark. I passed an old apartment building where the front door was wide open, swaying on a rusted hinge with a rhythmic creak thud, creak thud. It sounded like a heartbeat. I could see piles of old clothes and broken glass inside, the remains of lives that were simply discarded. I felt a wave of genuine nausea thinking about the families who were forced to live in this darkness because they had nowhere else to go. The hate here isn't loud, it's a silent, bitter resentment that the rest of the world just drove around them and forgot they existed. The most disturbing part of the night was the realization of how small Highland Park is. It's completely surrounded by Detroit, like an island of even deeper despair. Locals can't stand it because they are trapped in a financial trap that has no exit. Silas told me that sometimes, when it's really quiet, you can hear the hum of the city life from miles away, but it feels like it's on another planet. I looked up at the sky, and because there were no streetlights, the stars were incredibly bright. It was a beautiful sight that felt completely wrong. It was a reminder that nature is winning here, slowly erasing the tracks of humans who failed to take care of their own. By the time I made it back to my car, I was fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking from the sheer intensity of the silence. Every rustle in the weeds felt like a threat, and every dark window felt like an eye. I realized that Highland Park is hated because it is a warning. It's what happens when the money runs out and the lights go dark for good. As I drove back toward the lit-up parts of the highway, I felt a massive sense of relief, but the image of Silas sitting in that absolute darkness stayed with me. He is a living ghost in a dead city. That is the true story of Highland Park. It's a place that was left in the dark to be forgotten, and now the darkness is the only thing it has left. It's not just a hated town, it's a tragedy that's still unfolding in the shadows.